Hi everyone and welcome back for the new intermediate Spring Boot demo. Today we are going to see how to create a Spring Boot application using multiple Maven modules. In most Spring Boot demos, only a single Maven module is used, and the reason behind that is simplicity. However, in real-life applications, in complex applications, you'll probably have to use multiple Maven modules. You'll probably have a Maven module for your business logic, another one for database access, another one for user interface. So I think it's really important to see a demo where you can actually split your pieces of functionality across multiple Maven modules. Let's get started. Let's check out the modules that we'll add in our application. We will have three Maven modules: domain, persistence, and web. Let's check them out one by one. Domain is the Maven module in which we'll add all the business logic. Things like entities and business services will all be added here. On top of domain, we'll have another module called persistence. This is where we'll have classes that deal with database access. So repositories and database headers are a good example of this. Last but not least, we'll have a web Maven module, which is the entry point in our application. And this module will contain the REST controllers, for example, and also the main class that fires up the entire Spring Boot application. As you can see, there is a relationship between the three modules. Domain contains business logic and does not depend on any other module. It doesn't care about the persistence technologies that you use, and it doesn't care about the user interface that we have. Persistence, on the other hand, has a dependency on domain, but it has no dependency on web. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you have a repository and you want to persist an entity, then you need to have access to it. So because the entity is stored in the domain module, the persistence one needs to be aware of it. So it needs to have a dependency on the domain module. And finally, the web is the outer layer, and it has dependencies on both persistence and domain. We are talking about a one-direction relationship between these three modules. And sometimes this architecture is called an onion architecture. It's exactly what we're going to build in today's demo. So without further ado, let's write some code. I fired up IntelliJ and I'll create a new project. I'll choose Spring Initializer, hit next, and now we need to define this form. The group name, I'll add RC for Romanian coder. The artifact will be Spring Boot multiple Maven modules. And now the only thing that you need to be aware of is the type of our project. Normally, if you had a Spring Boot application with a single Maven module, then you can leave the type as is. So you can leave the type as Maven project. But we'll have a Spring Boot application with three Maven modules that we'll define later on. So we cannot leave it like this. We need to change the project type from Maven project to Maven pom. And what this will do is it will generate us a project template with only a pom file. So we will not have the source folder which contains Java classes. Those Java classes will be defined in the modules that we'll add later on. Okay, we leave the packaging as jar, Java version 1.8, okay. And we only need to change the description, so we'll say Spring Boot with multiple Maven modules. We'll click next. As dependencies, we'll take a dependency on web and a dependency on JPA and H2. Okay, hit finish. And now we'll have our empty project template. So if you look here, we see that we do not have any source folder. Instead, we have a pom.xml file. And the other thing that we need to modify here is, again, the packaging. Normally, if you had a single Maven module, then you can leave jar. But because our Java classes are going to be spread across multiple Maven modules, the packaging of the root. So in the root pom.xml file we cannot have jar packaging, so we need to change the packaging in the root pom file from jar to pom. And now that we have defined our root pom file, we can go to create the Maven modules and the dependencies between them. The first module that we're going to add is the domain module. In order to add a module, we can go to our to our project. We can right click and say new module. Now we're not going to choose Spring Initializer again, we already did this for our project. Instead we're going to pick add a new Maven module. We'll hit next, and then we need to give our module a name. In our case it's domain. We click next, and please be sure that your new Maven module is added in a separate folder, because each Maven module will have its own POM file, and if you don't add each module to its own folder, then the POM file of your module will collide with the root POM file. So please make sure that each Maven module has its own folder and you'll have no problems whatsoever. And now we click finish, and you see we've got our first module. Now of course this module, if you open it, it has a POM file, and it also has a source folder containing all the Java classes, the resources, the tests, and so on and so forth. Now in the POM file for domain, we see that we already have a link to the parent, and the parent is our root project, so it's our Spring Boot application. And then one thing that we need to add is the packaging. Now the packaging for our entire project is POM, but the packaging for each individual module needs to be jar, because our application will be composed of each module will be compiled to a jar, and then the web, which is the Spring Boot application, will then have dependencies on the domain jar and on the persistence jar. So we can say packaging jar, and we are done with the domain module. Moving on, we can add another module which will be called persistence. Hit next. Again, I'm sure that this module is in its own folder, and I think I have a typo here, sorry. Yes, persistence. Next, finish, and we get the new module. And we have another POM file for the persistence module, and we also need to add the packaging and set it to jar. And now the persistence module has a dependency on the domain module. The domain has no dependencies because it only contains business logic, but the persistence has a dependency on domain, and we need to model this dependency inside the POM file. So we'll add the dependencies tag, and inside the dependencies tag we'll add a new dependency on domain. So we have a dependency on a project defined within our application. And finally we can go ahead and add our third module, which is the web module. We'll call it web. Hit next. It's in a new folder. Cool. Finish. And now we get our third Maven module, and again we need to define the packaging, which is jar, and the web is the outer layer of our application, so it has two dependencies, one on domain and one on persistence. We need to model these dependencies again, so we'll add a dependencies tab, and then we'll add one dependency on domain and another dependency on persistence. Okay, so now we have defined our three Maven modules, and we can go ahead and add some classes. The first class that we'll create is our entity. Because it's an entity, we'll store it in the domain module. So we'll go to source, main Java, and we'll add a new package. We'll add a new package. We'll call it rc from Romanian coder.domain. And here we'll add our entity, which is going to be called hotel. So a new Java class, hotel. Okay, and our hotel is an entity. And now let's add some basic properties. So we'll have private long ID. We'll have the hotel name, which is a string. We'll have the hotel classification, so the number of stars for the hotel, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll add another property, a boolean property, to let us know if the hotel is open or not. Okay, I need to put boolean. We need to add the annotation for ID, and we also need to add the annotation for the generated value, and the strategy is sequence. Okay, now we'll add two constructors. We'll add a protected constructor because I don't want to call my hotel without instantiating its fields. And then we'll add a public constructor which will take 3 arguments: the name, the classification, and if the hotel is open or not. Pretty basic stuff. Okay. Okay, and now we'll add some getters. So one for ID, a getter for name, a getter for classification, and another one if the hotel is open. And that's it for our entity. Now we want to keep this application pretty simple and focus on how to implement multiple Maven modules, so I'll not make a pretty complicated domain. We'll just use this entity. We've added the hotel class in the domain module, and now we'll move on to the persistence module. The persistence module will contain database related functionality. So it will contain the hotel repository and a database seeder that will populate our database when the Spring application fires up. We'll open the persistence module. We have to create a package. We'll call it rc.persistence. And now we can add our data classes. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create the hotel repository, which is an interface. We'll annotate it with the repository interface, and it has to implement, actually has to extend the JPA repository, and we need to pass in our entity type and the type of the ID, which in our case is long. That's it for the hotel repository, and now we need to add a database seeder. We'll call it db seeder. It's a component. Okay. And it needs to implement the command line runner interface. If we implement the command line runner interface, then this class is going to be automatically executed by our Spring Boot application at startup. So we can populate our database exactly after our application gets started. And I want a dependency on hotel repository, private hotel repository. Okay, I'll generate a constructor, and in Spring 1.3 and before you needed to add the auto wired interface. But if you have in Spring, starting with Spring 1.4, if you have a single constructor, then you do not need to add the auto wired interface. Spring will automatically figure out how to inject your bean, and that's pretty cool. I just wanted to point this out. Okay, and now let's create some hotels. So my first hotel, let's call it Marriott. It will have 5 stars and it's open. Okay, let's add another one. Let's call it Ibis. It will have 3 stars and it's not open. And finally, let's add Golden Tulip. it will have 4 stars and it's open. If you have IntelliJ 2016.3, you also get this cool feature. So you actually get the parameter names alongside with the arguments that you pass in for various methods or constructors. So name classification is open, is provided to me by IntelliJ, and I think it's a pretty cool feature because it makes the code a lot more readable. So you know that true is actually this open property, you know that 5 corresponds to the classification argument parameter. So it makes the code much more readable, and I think it's a pretty cool feature that was added in here. Now we can create a list of hotels. And we'll add all the hotels to this list. So we'll add Marriott, we'll add Ibis, we'll add Golden Tulip, and finally we're going to save them using our repository component. We'll say save and we'll pass in the entire hotel collection. And now we have our repository, we have our database header, we can move on to the web module. The user interface is the entry point of our Spring Boot application. So we need to add 2 classes in here. We need to add the REST controller, and we need to add the main class for our Spring Boot application so that everything gets bootstrapped. Therefore, we'll go to web source main, we'll add a package, we'll call it rc.web, and we'll start by adding our first REST controller. We'll call it hotel controller. This is a REST controller. We'll add the specific annotation, and the REST controller will just add a simple method to retrieve all the hotels in our database, which means we'll need the dependency on hotel repository, and we can generate our constructor. Again, we're using Spring Boot 1.4, so there is no need to add the auto-wired interface because we have a single constructor. And now we'll add a method that will return the list of hotels from the database. We'll call it get hotels, and this method will use our hotel repository to retrieve the hotels. Actually, hotel repository, and the hotel repository, it implements the JP interface, which means we get some methods out of the box, and the find all method will return all the hotels stored in our database. So we can return our hotels, and now we need to create a request mapping. You create a request mapping, the value is hotels, and the method is HTTP GET. But in Spring 1.4, we have a new annotation for mappings. Instead of having this annotation, which is rather long, we can simply use the get mapping and just pass in the URL which we'll use to bind this method to our HTTP request. The get mapping, we have the URL, and of course it's automatically bound to the get method, and we have get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping. They do the same thing as request mapping, but they're nicer to use because they're not that long. I don't need this import. Okay, and this is our REST controller, pretty basic stuff. And the last thing that we need to do is we need to add the main class in our Spring Boot application. We'll call it demo application. We'll add the Spring Boot application annotation, and this needs to have the public static void main method. And now we can just say spring application run, and we use demo application dot class, and this is the entry point in our Spring Boot app. Okay, we have our 3 modules, we have added all the classes that we need. We can now try and start our app. Before we run this app, there is one more thing that I forgot to do, and that is I have to add the h2 connection string to the application properties class. I'll just copy it from here because I don't know it by heart, and now our application will know how to communicate with our h2 database. Okay, we have everything set up. Let's make a first attempt to run our application. And we get an error. Now, normally, if you would have used a single Maven module, this application would have worked. And one of the things that I found to be very frustrating when building Spring Boot apps with multiple Maven modules is that you kind of get these strange errors when you're trying to run your application, even though you know that you did everything correctly. And on purpose, I want to show you all the errors that you can encounter building these kinds of apps. So we'll take them one by one, and if you encounter one of them, you'll know how to fix it. Now, the first error does something like, okay, the application failed to start because the hotel repository bean could not be found. Now, why is that? Well, our Spring Boot application is defined in the web module, and by default it performs a component scan when it's bootstrapped. But that component scan is restricted to the module and the packages within actually it's limited to the packages where our Spring Boot application is in. So in our case, our Spring app will only scan for repositories in the web module and in the packages in here. And as you know, our repository is not in the web module, but it's in the persistence module. So we need to let Spring know to scan for repositories in the persistence module or in other packages if need be. And for that, we have a new annotation called enable JPA repositories. And here we can pass a list of base packages. And our repository is in a package called rc.persistence. If you remember, we have our persistence module and we have a package called rc.persistence, and here we have our database header. So this is the package name that we need to add in here. Okay, let's give it another try and see if it works. And we get another error. But notice that this time we have a different error. And basically we cannot create the hotel controller bean because, and at the end of this line, we don't have a managed bean of type rc-domain.hotel. So somehow our application is unable to find the hotel entity. And the reason is the same as for the JPA repositories. Our application scans for entities only within the packages contained in the module where it's defined, so only inside the web module. And we need to let Spring know to scan for entities outside of this module in the domain 1. And for that, we'll add another annotation called entity scan. And again, we need to pass in a list of base packages where Spring should scan for entities. And the package for the entities is only one, it's rc.domain. Okay. Domain, and here we have another package called rc.domain, and this is the package that we need to add here. We can give it another try and see if it works this time. And it appears that our application has started on port 8080. I'll fire up Blisk, which is a web browser for developers, and it's actually a pretty cool browser to debug your web applications. And we'll go to localhost 8080 slash hotels. Okay, we'll hit enter, and notice that we get an empty array, but that's not correct, because we have a database seeder that should have populated our database with free hotels. If you remember, we have database seeder here, and this is one of the most frustrating errors that you may encounter. The application works, but it doesn't behave as it should, and the reason for it is that the database seeder is a component. So it's not an entity, it's not a repository, it's a component. And again, Spring Boot scans for components only within the module where it's defined. So actually this class is never invoked and it's never run. That's the reason why we get an empty collection of hotels. But the overall application is running, but obviously it's not doing what it should. So we have to fix this. And we fix it by adding another annotation called component scan. And again, we can define base packages, and we'll add rc.persistence, because our component resides in the persistence module. But components can be scattered across all the modules. So maybe if you have a more complex application, you can say, okay, I have components everywhere, so I have components in the domain, and I also have components in the web. Okay, you don't have to add this, but I'm just trying to give you a real life example of how this configuration could look like. And let's fire up the application one more time and see if it now has the correct behavior. Okay, our application started. We'll open Blisk again and refresh our page. And now you see that we get a list with all the hotels that we defined in our database header. So finally, we made our Spring application work with multiple Maven modules. The most important thing to know is that basically you create your application as you would, with any Spring Boot app. But then again, at the very end, on your class that contains the Spring Boot main method, you need to add this free annotation: enable GPU repositories, entity scan, and component scan. And these annotations allow Spring to scan for your beans outside the module where your main class is defined. And as you saw, our app is now working. Before we conclude this video, there are two more things that I want to discuss here. The first one is about these free annotations. We have a pretty simple example here, but in a complex application you might have more modules than I do. You might have your components scattered across the modules. So you might have repositories, I don't know, maybe in 2 modules. You might have components scattered across everywhere. Your domain might be split up even more. So writing all the packages in which we want Spring Boot to scan for our beans can become a little difficult, especially for large applications. But there is a nice way to simplify this. I don't know if you noticed, but in our case, each package name is prefixed by rc. We have rc.domain, rc.persistence, and rc.web. And this allows us to do a pretty neat trick. Instead of specifying all the packages, I can just say rc. So I can remove everything and just leave rc. And what Spring will do now is it will scan all the packages that start with RC. So it will scan for GPA repositories in all our modules, it will scan for entities in all our modules, and it will scan for components in all our modules. Ultimately, the result is the same, but this approach tends to be simpler. The other one can be a viable option, but only if you choose to do so. And to prove that it works, I've started up the application one more time, and we should get the same result as before. Okay, we refresh the page and we get the exact same result. The second thing that I want to mention is about Maven. We've started our application from the IDE and everything is working perfectly. But let's try and start our application from Maven. So we can go to our root, we can say, let's do a Maven clean. And then let's try to do a Maven package. I'll do a Maven package. And we get an error. So obviously we couldn't generate the jar file that we can then execute via the command line, for example. It works in the IDE, it doesn't work with Spring. And to fix it, there is one last thing that has to be done, and that is, you remember that we have a root pom.xml file, and we have a Maven plugin that is in the root of our pom file, and we also have the Spring Boot starter web that is also in the root pom file, and we need to move these two configuration pieces in the web pom file, because our web module is the actual module that contains basically the web application, and it's also the entry point in our Spring Boot app. So these two things need to be moved in the web. We'll first copy the web dependency, and we'll go to web and we'll add this dependency here. And we also need to copy the Spring Boot Maven plugin from here, and we need to put it in our pom.xml file within the web module. And now if we run Maven clean again, okay, and then we try to execute Maven package, and this time it should work. And that's it. You see, you have build succeeded. And to prove it, we'll actually go to the new target folder that is in here. We'll show in Explorer, we go to target, and now we see we have a web snapshot, and we can open a commands window. Okay, and we can just type in Java jar and the name of our web module. We'll hit enter, and now our Spring Boot application will fire up, and we started it using a terminal. So everything is working, but be aware that you need to make those modifications in order for Maven to function properly with multiple modules. Okay guys, that's it for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. You can find more software development tutorials on my blog at www.romaniancoder.com, and you can also follow me on Facebook at Romanian Coder. Thank you very much for watching, have a great day and write amazing code. Goodbye.